and then I went into a more concentrated form of isolation. And then my mother died during that period, and then I also almost died too. So I had a health crisis, and then also probably mental and emotional crisis at the same time, because I went into grief as my mother passed away, and then the cascading effect of emotions that I had to deal with in solitary confinement.
Awe Genge, this is Mental Matters, hosted by Asekho Toto.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Mental Matters. I'm your host, Asekho Toto, and before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back into our conversation.
Firstly, my first question towards you. What made you go to US? Like, what made interest of you going to US?
So when I was studying medicine, I was in Shanghai, and most of my friends were American. And I always felt quite connected to the American culture. So I'm Japanese Australian, so I was born and raised in Australia. And Australia is, it's a really beautiful country, and but there are many challenging things about Australia, and I didn't really feel like I fit in Australian culture very well. Especially when I was growing up. I'm from Perth, which is the capital of Western Australia, and it wasn't very diverse. And when I went to Shanghai, I met people from America there was a lot more diversity there. Within the culture. So I wanted to be amongst people who are more like-minded. So I ended up in California after I finished medical school because I felt very connected to American people and the culture.
Firstly, before I just comment on this, I really, in terms of when you mentioned that you're part Japanese, I had good goosebumps, because I would say that one of the cultures that I truly respect and truly find fascinating is the Japanese culture, and how it is intertwined with it doesn't break its own culture just because it wants to fit in with the norms. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Because I'm seeing that you're quite closer to the camera. That's why I'm asking. So as I've said that, it's quite fascinating. And going back to the initial interview, and in terms of, you mentioned that you went to medical school. What motivated you to pursue a career in internal medicine and integrated pharmaceuticals with phonetical medicine?
So I was always interested in medicine from a young age. So in Australia, we were encouraged to think about a career when we were very young. So I decided that I wanted to go to medical school when I was 14. And I always felt very drawn to being of service. And I thought that my interest in health and illness, I was exposed to many sick people from a young age. My mother was very ill. And I think one of the motivating factors of going into medicine was watching people suffer and wanting to help people. And I think that was probably what drew me to medicine, was being exposed to illness at a young age.
That's a fascinating way to answer, and also being able to be to wanting to be part in the middle school at a very young age, that is very rare. And most of, I would say at that age, I had this thing of probably when if I would say that I want to be a doctor, I want to be a police officer, things like that. It is very fascinating to hear that at a medical school. Would you say that it was very specific in terms of what did you want to become?
It was very specific. So I met a doctor when I was around that age who practiced Chinese medicine. So he only practiced a part of what I do, but still I was exposed to something very different. So I was exposed to him, and then I was also exposed to different alternative medicines from a young age because my mother was very interested in that. So she often sought after alternative medicine. So I was exposed at a very young age. So there was already a curiosity about it, and then and at the same time in Australia, it's encouraged to think about what we want to do as a career, from around middle school, and then by the time that most people finish high school, it was pretty much expected that we would have a profession picked out by the I would say, by the time we were around 16 years old, it was encouraged that we should really know what we're doing with our lives. So it was just, for me, it was normal because most of my friends, they pretty much seemed to know what they wanted to do too.
That's
Yeah.
great. And I like the fact that they promote in terms of what do you truly want and not something that needs to be forced upon you. Because one thing that I realize, people that I've seen are very, I would say, are very tired of their jobs they have. They're unhappy, and most of them, it really takes a toll on your mental well-being when you do something that you don't like. And
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
just because it gives you money. You do it just because it gives you money. If you had a chance to go back, you would do something that you loved. And something that I would say here in South Africa, there's this thing of you need to choose a job that will give you money, a job that will sustain you, not only you, but also your family. So I like, in terms of, on my case, I really appreciative to my mother because she didn't have this thing of, no, we won't do this, you will do this. And most families are like that. So I just want to say this out there that I'm really appreciative to my mother. So going back to you arriving in the States and having friends in America, would you say that you had some difficulties in adapting into a new environment from Australia to America?
Not so much actually, because the Australian culture and American is quite similar. So obviously, I didn't have any issues with language, and I didn't find. I actually really enjoyed being in California because I had spent almost a decade in Shanghai, which was a very, very different culture from Australian culture. So it was much more similar to my home culture of Australia. Of course, it's different from the Japanese culture, but I actually didn't grow up in Japan. I only spent holidays there, so it wasn't a culture shock.
Mm.
Um, of course, there's some minor differences, but in general, I felt like I assimilated well into American culture and quite quickly too.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. And as I mentioned that you as you mentioned that the fact that you written a book, and when you started, I mentioned that I want to go deeper on writing inspiration of this book. And so can you tell us, and if I'm not mistaken, you wrote this book after an Australian quarantine?
Yes, yes. So my first book was a memoir, which it was published just over a year ago now, but the event happened in 2021 during the height of the pandemic, and Australia was going through a lockdown. Their borders were closed. So in order to go back to Australia, you had to go through a 2-week mandated hotel quarantine, which is being inside a hotel room with windows that are bolted shut with a guard outside your door. And the only reason why I went back was because my mother was very ill. She was dying. So I went to see her for the last time. So that's what my memoir is about. And all the, it's called 14 days because it's a 2 week long quarantine period and all the challenges that I experienced during that 2 week period.
Mm. And as a professional, how did that, in terms of COVID, and as let let me take it on to myself in terms of, let me make an example. When during the pandemic, when the pandemic started, that's when I started this podcast. At first, I didn't know what to do per se, and at some point, I realized something, that I was dealing with some mental health issues, and I needed to talk about it. So
Yes.
I had this general idea of starting a podcast, actually from Gary Vee. I was listening to Gary Vee and talking about starting a podcast, starting new things. So I had this initial idea. No, I want to talk about mental health, but I didn't. This was back in 2019, and I started this podcast, I think 2020. Yeah, it was
2021, yes.
around those times. So I started this and started talking to the mic, and it was very different from me. And because at some point I thought I was going out of my mind, so it was something new. So as time went, I realized that starting this focus will help people in terms of the pandemic, because at some point pandemic showed that most people suffer from mental health in terms of depression because of their isolation,
Yes,
of
absolutely.
being alone, of not having the interaction, that going out, have socializing, and same, I had that thing, but fortunately I was able to get people on my podcast on all of that. What my question towards you is the fact that as a professional in the medicine industry, what was your take in terms of quarantine? Did it ever had a an effect upon you?
The negative effect that it had on me, you mean the 2 week period when I was in Australia, is that correct?
Yeah. The pandemic.
Yes. So that was I went through a mental and emotional crisis because I was in isolation. We were already in the middle of the pandemic, and we were already, we're all already in a state of isolation. And then I went into a more concentrated form of isolation. And then my mother died during that period. And then I also almost died too. So I had a health crisis, and then also probably, a mental and emotional crisis at the same time, because I went into grief as my mother passed away. And then, the cascading effect of emotions that I had to deal with in solitary confinement. So I was in an extreme emotional state, I would say, for quite some time, and triggered by the fact that I had an anaphylactic reaction. So I almost died during that whole. So there was so many things. My physical body was in crisis, and my mental emotional state was in crisis all at the same time.
Yeah, I can only imagine that was very traumatic, being able to be isolated and also have having a loved one, like dealing with grief, because grief has something that also had an impact on my mental well-being, but not back then, but recently, because I realized that as much as I feel like as people, we process grief in different ways.
Yes.
My own way was in a way of keep on working, not focusing on my emotions as much as I am doing this. I have been talking with experts on mental well-being, talking to people who have dealt with grief, talking to people that have dealt with depression and anxiety and these different mental disorders. And I realized recently when I had a guest from, I think it was Australia. Yeah, she was from Australia, where we had this conversation about grief, and where at some point I broke down in a way of taking a step back and looking on how I have created this coping mechanism, because from, I think it was from 2021, 2021, 2022. I know it's 2020, 2021, 2022, when I, on all these 3 years, I lost my grandmother, I lost my uncle, I lost my stepfather, and consecutively through the 3 years. So at some point, I realized, no, I need to take care of my mental health. And when you say that you had to deal with grief, I actually understand, but not in a perspective of being isolated, of not able to talk with people, not having that full support of people. And yeah, I really get you. And it was quite traumatic. I would guess, I would assume that it was very traumatic.
It is very traumatic, and the challenging part about going through grief is that sometimes sorry, in a crisis, it's difficult to process. There's also, I'm sure you might have had this experience too, that grief and processing grief is quite exhausting.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you don't have the energy to really process what you're going through, and you have to rest until you're well enough to then process your feelings. Because if you don't have the energy, you're not going to be able to process it. So, I was so tired and exhausted from everything that happened. And also I couldn't really grieve very much because I was already in such a physical state that even if I tried to cry or anything, my entire respiratory and sinus system would completely close up. So, I had to be very, very careful and measured in terms of how I processed my feelings. But, obviously it's important to process them at the right time. I do think with grieving that there is a timing aspect to it. And I'm sure I'm sorry about all the losses. And it's very, very difficult when it's back to back because you feel like you can't get a break, right? And you just constantly getting pulled underwater. But to be gentle with yourself and to realize that this is a process. And the thing about grieving is the thing about grief is to actually grieve, but also to realize that it's not necessarily, it gets easier, but it never completely 100% goes away. It's not like you can just move on with your life. You will always miss the people who have passed. There'll always be a part that we'll miss them. And I think that that's important to understand, that just because you miss somebody, you will continue to miss somebody. It's not like, that you've successfully processed grief because then you no longer think about them or, miss them. That's, I think, a misconception. Like there'll always be grief there. But I think it finds its place.
Talking about the fact that I would like to quote you, you will always miss the people who have passed. And I think I think it was last month of last month, I'm not quite sure. Whereas I had this thought, and where I have realized that I really had a strong relationship with my grandmother at some point, whereas I even had this thought of, I'm so sad that my grandmother won't see me succeed, because I had this belief that I didn't do enough. I had this belief that I wasn't there for her enough as she was there for me, because I was raised by her most of the time, because I stayed with her. And as I don't know about you, but grandmothers have this thing of trying to discipline. She would usually discipline us, but at some point, at this point that I was in, I just missed her. I missed her, the bad times and the good times, and it grieves. And as you've said, that you need to have energy to deal with grief, something that I didn't create within myself because I pushed myself in a way of don't think about it, just work, 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 and didn't realize that it was bad for me, and I needed to first take a step back and analyze and be have that self awareness that no, I'm processing grief now, and I just need time to be off in terms of work and focus on myself, focus on my mental well-being. And it was really hard. I don't know why. It was really hard. And also, I just want to dive deep and in terms of writing, what role does storytelling play in mental health and healing?
I think the process of writing for me has been an important healing journey because it helps me to process. As I'm writing, I'm processing my feelings. So, a lot of people like to journal to help process their feelings. And I enjoyed journaling too. And so I took that to, a different level of making it into actually a book. So I think it's the same process of being able to filter through to be able to analyze what you're feeling. And because of when writing a book, it's quite repetitive. You have to go back over and over again. So each time I wrote another draft, like I think for the first book, I might have written like 7 or 8 drafts. Like I can't remember how many, but there was quite a lot. And each time I wrote more, as I felt like I refined the story, but not only was it just for my writing skills, but it was for my emotional well-being too. Like I felt like I processed just a little bit more with each draft. So that was very healing for me, and I'm glad that I did that. I really wrote the first book really for my own healing journey, not necessarily to share it with other people, but I mean, of course, if anybody.
Hello?
And
You just cut out on my side, and I think your audio is still connecting.
sorry, we got disconnected.
I'm seeing that because it just cut out
Yeah.
while you were talking. I'm not quite sure if the thingy, the Zoom thought that your response. I'm not quite sure.
Oh, yeah. Basically the completion of writing the story was it helped me to put some because finishing a book, even though it's not necessarily finishing it's not the end of my life or anything like that, but there's some level of completion. There's some kind of closure that happens when finishing a book, at least for me. So there was some level of closure, I think, that happened when I actually finished or published the book. So that was good for me. It was
As
helpful.
as a fellow writer, I would like to agree with you there. And the more you on that those graphs, and you realize that at some point you want to change things, then in every draft you change things, and also it bit of assisted me in terms of my mental well-being. Writing has really played a role on my mental health as in general, but I don't know about healing because there are some things that I haven't processed at all, and also that involves childhood trauma, and that I feel like it's something that I need to work on mostly, and yeah, so it really helps in terms of writing. That's how I try by any means to find healing, or to I would say to come to these things of, no, I'm have mental health issues, and I'm willing to look upon them, and yeah, in writing, and also but not only in writing, but also talking about them, having this conversation with you. I learn things in terms of, no, I need to look at this perspective. As much as I have my own perspective, I need to have different perspective. Probably this different perspective will assist me on finding a solution to this problem. Will find me a solution in terms of finding healing, knowing that I'm not the only one out there. And also one thing about mental well-being is the fact of, you have this belief that you are alone. You are the only
Yes,
person
exactly.
experiencing this thing, and it's your first, and you're the last person to experience this thing. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up in terms of writing. And I just want to speak about your second book. Whereas it is a fictional, it's a
Yes, correct.
fiction and inspired by your patients and their complex trauma. So can you share some insights into how these stories influenced your writing?
So, as a doctor of integrative medicine, I often see people with chronic illnesses. And a lot of chronic illnesses are from complex trauma, from usually from childhood. Not always, but most people have things that they go through traumatic things, right? But I think that in my patients' cases, there's different traumatic things that happened over a long period of time that affected their nervous system. And when you're in a state of chronic stress like that, it affects the immune system and general health. It often tends to start affecting, your digestive system. And then as soon as your digestive system starts to get affected, then, your serotonin levels start to get affected too, which is, so much to do with sleep and mood. And then it starts to cascade, unfortunately, into all sorts of different problems. Once you start not sleeping well and you start feeling more depressed and anxious, then it can lead to long-term different problems. So I wrote a book about, a character who had some childhood trauma that she only remembers as an adult, because this is quite common that when you were young, and as you were saying very accurately, we can go through our lives busy, 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 working really, really hard, and avoiding, not necessarily even intentionally, right? But almost accidentally avoiding trauma from our childhood or from our past. So this is something that happens to this woman. She, in this fictional character, so she's, very, very busy raising her children, working, being married, and then she decides to have a change, and things start to quieten down a little bit in her life, and then she starts to look within. Her children have left her home, and this is often a time when people start to become a little bit more introspective, because there's a significant shift. Like, the role as a parent is not as it's just not as time consuming when your children have left your home. So there's this character had a little bit of space, so her life didn't stop, but it slowed down a little bit, and she had the opportunity to look at herself. And so, kind of similar to you, that so then she started looking at herself, and that's when she remembered her childhood trauma. And then she finds a therapist, and she goes on this whole journey. And so the story is about that journey. But it's even though it's fictional, I think it reflects a lot of people, because this is a sexual trauma, and 1 in 3 women approximately, and possibly even 1 in 4 men go through some kind of sexual trauma. So it's a very, very common trauma I wanted to write a trauma that either the reader could identify themselves with, or they would know somebody else who's gone through it, because I wanted it to be a relatable experience. And the fact that sexual trauma is an extremely deep wound, and it's very, very difficult to navigate through. It tends to leave deep um, wounds inside the psyche and inside the body too. So it affects people on all levels. So I wanted to write about that.
And also, like, just to add on that, you said that as much as it's fiction, and I believe that most people prefer fiction than self-help books, because I feel like, in a way, as much as it's a fiction, it gives you that, as a reader, that thing of, no, it's a fiction world, anything happens, and some people will just want to get out of the reality because they have faced some, in terms of mental well-being, problems within their lives. And I feel like that's why people really enjoy those fiction books. And I just want to touch on the human healing. And as I've said that when we started, in terms of, I listed the things that I would like be interested more on talking about, which is human healing, one of them. So, as I've said, that sometimes people, instead of using laughter as a medicine in terms of trying to find happiness in everything, they hide behind it. Instead, after they are no fun of everyone, they starting from scratch and processing that mental, let's say, that depression, that anxiety of saying that they are alone, they are depressed, no one is there for them. How do you use how do you use humor as that coping mechanism? co- mm, Coping mechanism is how to use humor as a coping mechanism and try to really be super and not falling to that thing of hiding behind humor.
Gotcha. That's a very important question to ask. But I think there's a fine balance where we can find humor, but also at the same time spend time being real with our feelings too. So there's times when humor is appropriate, and then there's times when we need to put the humor aside and allow ourselves to feel the pain or the sadness or the anger or whatever emotions that we have. But to be able to do both, to be able to be real with ourselves, but also to have a coping mechanism of being able to find the humor in situations, or going to do things that will make us laugh, because that's really important for our brain chemistry, laughter, right?
Yeah.
But that you can't just do that alone. You can't just laugh all the time, because then you start going into avoidant behavior. So you want to make sure you're doing a little bit of both. That's usually what I would recommend.
And also, I always had this thing of everyone saying that, no, I laugh too much. I laugh too much in terms of, always find something to laugh at when it comes to that thing. And in some way, I knew that the fact that it is dealing with some things, most of the time I isolate myself most of the time, and I stay in the room and no going out. And it really took a toll on me in a way of not being able to be around people. Someone who really enjoys going out, someone who doesn't want to be alone most of the time. But as years went, I started going during weekends. I will stay at home and do nothing and not go out. During the week, I'm go to work and come back and do the same thing. So it had, I always used humor as something to hide behind, of not something that as a coping mechanism, as something that was positive. And in a way, I never had this conversation around hiding behind humor. And I always, when some people ask me that why I always laugh at things, I didn't give them that answer of, no, I'm hiding behind humor in terms of running away from my problems. And in a way, through that, I found that I'm able to joke around some certain things, and people wouldn't suspect anything when I joke around those things. And it has had immense influence upon how I look on mental well-being and how I look at situations in terms of it has created this thing of self-awareness, whereas I know what I'm thinking when I do something. I will I will first analyze the environment, and if I'm comfortable enough, I will talk. Okay, no, I'm going through this. Depending if I trust that person to the extent of no, I can trust you. I can tell you this because you are my friend, or you're someone that I truly trust with these emotions, because as men, we quite not in that thing of trusting people with our own emotions, of not being vulnerable enough to talk about our mental well-being. And some of us use that laughter just to hide from behind it because of not showing people that no, we are feeling this way. And yeah, yeah. That's round that wraps that up. Yeah. So it's very hard for me. I don't know that.
Yes, I think for a lot of people, if you have the experience of sharing information, very vulnerable personal information, and feeling judged by other people, being told that you're wrong or there's something wrong with you for feeling a certain way, you're going to want to shut down and not share anything about you. And so it's very important when you're sharing these things to find people who have compassion, who understand your feelings, have had similar experiences that are relatable, because otherwise opening up to these people who are judgmental is not going to be helpful for you at all. And,
Definitely.
I could see why you would want to avoid sharing any of this stuff and just kind of joking around. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's easy to do. It's going to feel so much safer for you to do that,
yeah.
to just kind of joke around and be kind of goofy, and so you don't have to be vulnerable, because maybe that audience or whoever it is that you're speaking to, you're not going to feel safe around, because safety is the key factor for being vulnerable and to be able to share this information. And that's tricky, because not everybody has a compassionate ear. A lot of people are quite judgmental. If you say like, depressed, or I'm going through something really difficult, and a lot of people will say things like, "Oh, you should just get over it," or something.
Yeah.
So and that's not going to be helpful if somebody's
At
going
all.
through
At
a rough
all.
time. Helpful, not helpful.
And it goes just to add on that, and words have power. That's something that other people don't realize. And when it comes to mental health, and for example, if let's say someone says to you, like, keeps on insulting you about your mental well-being, I feel like that's the reason why most people commit suicide. The fact of not just because they wanted to do that, but it's because of other people, of calling them names, of not realizing that it is quite difficult for them to process the whole thing, and you go and insult them, and you go call them names, and that creates another thing of mental well-being. It creates something that in that insecurity that it decreases their self-esteem. That's where I've seen it, and it's quite difficult. And also, I'm just saying that we are all almost out of time, and as much as I would like to go on, this conversation it's quite intriguing conversation. And yeah, man, before I let you go, what final message would you like to leave our our listeners regarding mental health and healing? A second question: how can listeners connect with you and follow your work?
So I think that with mental health is just to not give up. Yeah, and to keep searching for the right people that are going to help you, and the people who, as I was saying, who have compassion for you and who are not going to shut you down, but going to listen with kindness, are going to encourage you to, open up more and to express yourself, and where you feel safe and validated, that your feelings are validated by these persons. So that might be a professional person or just a friend or a mentor or somebody who has experience in the right language. So you have to make sure, like, but you want to keep trying. It's important to to never give up in terms of your mental health. You're worthy of having happiness. You're worthy of being loved. You're worthy of getting whatever you want out of life, and that you also have a gift to give to the world. So to never give up. And my website is momokowrites.com, and I appreciate hearing from people. And so that's probably the best way to get in touch with me.
Again, thank you so much for reaching out, and also thank you so much for your time to share your story and share your writing, and also share your perspective around mental health in general, because I feel like we need to have more of this conversation as a society to break that stigma around mental health. And I love the fact, one thing that I love is the fact that we dive deeply on the conversation around grief and how it really affects one in terms of, and having as I've mentioned earlier, that as people we have different ways to cope with grief, and I really enjoyed the section when we spoke about grief. So thank you so much.
Of course, thank you so much. It was lovely chatting with you.